Neurodiversity for a more inclusive future. How many of you have heard the term neurodiversity? That makes me really excited because although it's been around since the 80s, it's really now gaining a movement. So we're in the kind of 70s, 80s, we were talking people first language. I still use people first language. We're now moving into this movement, which is an advocacy movement from autistic people of accepting and embracing neurodiversity. All right, what we'll cover, we're going to look at a little bit of a history of autism. We can't know where we're going unless we know where we've been. We're also going to look at common traits and experiences. And notice how it says common traits and experiences instead of diagnostic criteria. So you'll notice a shift in the language as I'm talking to you. Cultural perspectives of autism. It's not viewed the same way everywhere. So we might think all people with autism look the same as people with autism in the United States. Come on. But if you look at other countries, you're going to see a difference in not only what those common traits are, but also what is expected of people's behavior. We'll also look at challenges faced in different environments, and this is what I'm going to ask for your participation to shout out some environments, and we're going to talk about what are some of the challenges that might be faced. And then look at strategies for fostering acceptance and inclusion. Okay. All right, so the what? 1908, we have Mr., I'm going to say it in German, Eugen Bleuler, and he was a psychiatrist who specialized in schizophrenia. And he coined this term autism, but specifically looking at the most severe cases of autism. He used the phrase autism because he got the word from the Greek term autos, meaning self. And he said, there's these children who are just turning into themselves because the outside world is so dark. So they're turning in to avoid the outside. And so that was his description. So you're going to notice a shift and a change. And then fast forward to like the 1940s, and you're going to see Mr. Connor. So he was also a psychiatrist, and he specialized in schizophrenia. And he looked at young children and said, oh, I'm noticing these things really young. Children must have an innate inability to connect socially, to use functional language. And so when you hear that word innate, what is he getting at? That it's biological. That children are coming into this world with this innate inability. You still hear that deficit-minded reference, inability. And then we have Asperger. How many of you have heard Asperger before? Shocking. A lot of the psychologists back then were super egocentric and named a lot of stuff after themselves. So Asperger's syndrome was named after Hans Asperger. And he also was looking at this set of common traits and characteristics, but not so much for people with schizophrenia. He was looking at this in a more psychological concept. He was saying, oh, interesting. There's actually this really incredible intelligence in these people, in these children with autism. And so he said that, but then he labeled it autistic psychopathy, so autistic psychopathy. So interesting, intelligence and psychopathy don't really go hand in hand. And then, I mean, we're not gonna go too deep into it, but he also, his funding came from Nazis at that time, who were deep in the eugenics movement. And so any connection to a biological component of autism was a little concerning. We're like, oh, what was he trying to do there? But his research did influence a lot of new research studies and what we know about autism today. So that's the what. They're trying to figure out, what is this? We're all seeing this. What is it? So then we get to the why, and we start thinking, okay, so we know what it is. We're all seeing these similar things. What is this? Why are children getting to that what? So Fulstein and Rudder did what are known as twin studies. And so they looked at sets of twins and they said, okay, how likely is it that sets of twins have these traits in common? And what did they find? A biological influence on autism. Then we have Connor again. Oh, his is my least favorite. He said, well, we know why children are getting autism. It's their mothers. They're cold and they're distant. He referred to mothers as refrigerator mothers because of how cold they were to their children. And he also said to defend any children who were what we might consider as savants. So use a lot of really big words, could talk really intelligently about one specific topic. He said, oh, well, that's just because they're imitating their pompous parents. That's what he thought. So fun times with Connor. So then we get to an even more problematic person, Dr. Not So Dr. Wakefield. And I say that because he did get his medical license revoked. Yes. Why is that good? Because he did not one, but 2 studies where he was trying to confirm that the MMR vaccine caused autism. And then he published that research in the Lancet. And people were like, oh my gosh, freaking out. What are we going to do? Vaccines cause autism. And then people looked at his study and said, wow, this is not only flawed, this is fraud. And so now we know that vaccines do not cause autism. Let's say it together. Vaccines do not cause autism. Thank you so much. I can sleep better at night. Because what happened after this study, even though it was debunked by several other studies, and it continues to get debunked, is we have an entire movement of unvaccinated children. I mean, has anyone read the news about what's going on in Texas right now? Yes, measles. It's one of the most preventable diseases. But we know that because of this fear that's been established in the community, that we have a lot of children who aren't vaccinated. So concerning. So let's just cross him out because he really didn't contribute anything but a good story. So now we're going to look at the most recent research. In 2023, Matilde, say their last name, Sirnigliaro. So she did, and guess where this research was? Italy. UCLA. Oh. So go California, tricked ya. So UCLA, and she really, really big study, looked at over 4,500 children and found, in addition to genes that were found previously, a total of 152 different genetic variations that influence and have an impact on autism. 152.
I have a question though, is why can't, if somebody is thought to have autism, why can't they get a gene study done to verify that if it's a gene?
Money. So it is expensive. Genetic testing is expensive. It is a process. Somebody actually has to do that genetic testing. So it's also something that might be a little time consuming as well. Because, I mean, it would be interesting if we're like, okay, let's all 100 of us do a gene test and see how it goes. Victoria. I expect nothing less.
Some of these genes that it's possible that different alleles are turned on at different times. And isn't it possible also they've established that there are stuff that happens with one group and grandsons end up with issues.
Yes.
In fact, with us having the Napoleonic Wars, the World War I, World War II, right now we have a lot of kids that World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and Vietnam, the United States, not only there is, I lived through that, and there was major shifts in the society, as you can tell. Yeah.
And so that's a really great topic to bring up, because although we have all of this genetic information, we also know that it's not genes alone all the time. And so when you're saying a gene is turn on or turn off, that's what we call epigenetics. And so when a child could have a predisposition, and what they're finding are these genes are either new genes or a combination of genes or a mutation of genes. So it can happen a lot of different ways. So let's say this child has a gene mutation that's passed on from their father. Well, it could just sit there dormant, and then that child might be without oxygen for a little bit. Thank you for sharing that with me. Without oxygen for a little bit at birth, and maybe that's what turns on that gene. So that's the
On the gene. Say yes for the one. I said different genes.
And so we haven't seen any research that says there's an Asperger gene, but what we see is depending on what gene it is, if it's a mutation, if it's inherited, if it's turned on, if it's muted, that's where we get that spectrum of autism. It can look different for every single person. So I know that this is a topic that everyone's gonna have questions on. Do you mind if I save it for the very end? I have a whole slide with questions.
Okay, yeah, there's.
Is that okay?
What I'm thinking.
Okay, write it down for me.
I don't have to because it's me.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Just so we can make sure they only gave me an hour. And if you've had my class before, I could talk for 3. So, and then the how. So we now know the what, the why. We're still not 100% positive on one gene, one environmental influence, but we're getting closer. Now the how. How do we diagnose? So Wing and Gold. Dr. Wing actually was one of the first psychologists who had a child with autism, and that's what prompted her research. She was like, wait a second, looking at all of these previous researchers, and I'm not really seeing that they get my child. So let me do some more research. And so she was one of the first who identified that spectrum. She coined that term, spectrum, autism spectrum disorder, and was really key to having it in the DSM Diagnostic Statistical Manual as how autism is diagnosed. So really, really key, she in Gold. And now the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Do you know that it wasn't until 1990 that autism was a criteria that received support under this act? 1990. Think of all the children that came before that couldn't get services, that weren't protected under legislation to be included in their classroom. So we're getting closer to saying, all right, now children are included. Now we're getting an idea of the causal relationship. How are we going to include children and adults? Her partner in research.
Any connection to the one here in town?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, that would have been cool.
What's really cool is Dr. Wing is actually, how old is she? She's about to turn 93, I think. And she's actually pioneering the research on women and autism. Oh yeah, she's still really active in the autism world. And she is primarily focused on how do we make sure that women and girls don't slip through the cracks when it comes to diagnosis. All right, let's also look at symbols. How many of you have seen a little puzzle piece like on a bumper sticker or somewhere? Yeah. So that was actually started in the 60s. And it was started during a time where we were saying, there's something wrong. There's something wrong. What's happening? These children are like a broken puzzle, and we need to find all the pieces and put them together and fix them. We need to fix these children with autism because they're different. They're other. And then in the 90s is when we started getting introduced to people first language. Anybody familiar with people first language? So using a child with autism or a person who has autism. So if the person is first, the diagnosis comes second. It was considered super respectful. It's still considered super respectful. I still use it professionally, but how I've shifted is I respond when somebody tells me how they identify. I will never, ever correct or impose my views on somebody with autism or on a family of a child with autism. Like, oh, let me invalidate your experience, tell you how you should talk about your child. I would never do that. But we're shifting. We're shifting. So the infinity symbol is more recent, more 2000s. We're saying, oh, there's a spectrum of neurodiversity, and that infinity means that there's so many variables in human existence and in cognitive thought that we just can't even count them all. More inclusive, we're getting there, right? Like, oh, okay, we're all different in some way. In 2010, we have the rise of identity first language. So if person first language is person with autism, what's identity first language? Autistic person. So being raised and like ingrained in person first language, when I started hearing autistic person, I'm like, oh gosh, everything I know is wrong. And it was a hard culture shift, and I'm still adjusting to that. But I know that that language was stemmed from self-advocacy from autistic people. They're saying we're not ashamed of who we are or our diagnosis. We're autistic. You can say it. It's okay. It's not a bad word. So I'm like, oh, all right, put in my place there. 2015, we're really starting to embrace neurodiversity. We're saying, okay, we are all these beautiful butterflies that rise when we're supported. We all have differences. All of our patterns look different, but we can all fly with the right support, with the right inclusion. But we're not changing the butterfly. We're changing the environment so that the butterfly can thrive. Do you see that shift as it's happening? It's like, it's fascinating to me where we come from and then where we're going. The most recent one are the blue lights. So blue lights, blue ribbons, blue is like this theme of autism acceptance, neurodiversity acceptance, neurodiversity, embracing neurodiversity as a whole. I'm going to show a little bit of my bias. So because Autism Speaks is the group that has really started the blue light, I'm not going to buy into it yet. I'm going to see how it goes first, and then maybe I'll buy into it. All right. So let's look at common traits and experiences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the actual wording in the DSM-5. It's the latest diagnostic statistical manual. And then we're going to talk about how do we look at this through an embracing neurodiversity lens. Okay? So one of the common traits, one of the diagnostic criteria, persistent deficits in social communication, social interaction, social emotional reciprocity ranging from abnormal social approach, failure of normal back and forth conversations, to reduce sharing of interest, emotions, or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. So let's let that soak in. And let's think about how many of you have been in a really awkward conversation with someone else. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. And what's that feeling that you get during that awkward conversation? Lots of different ones. Help me, get me out of here. Is this person ever going to shut up? I can't get a word in. But how do I stand my ground? How do I get out of it? Yes.
Does it relate to whether you're feisty, calm, those 5 personality types?
It is dependent on
Back within that?
It's actually dependent on a lot of different things. How were you socialized? How were, did you receive ABA services that trained the uniqueness right out of you? So what is it that has caused this difference? So the point of that is those awkward conversations are a universal feeling, a universal experience. So how do we keep that in mind and say, okay, if I'm engaging with an autistic person and they are talking and they don't know when to stop. Well, have you ever been talking and not know when to stop? Yes, empathy. Let's build some empathy and say, wow, I really, if I want this person to stop, guess what's really helpful for people with autism? Say, okay, I'm done with this conversation now. Not rude, it's clear. You don't just be like, I'm done. Just very clear, done with this conversation.
How at NCIS, a lot of the team members speak to the lab person. They do a very good job of politely saying.
Oh, it's a show. Thank you. Yeah. I was like, NCIS. I'm thinking it's like a group. It's like, I have it. Save it though. And during questions, I promise I'll get back to you. Nonverbal communication. So deficits in nonverbal communication used for social interaction ranging from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication, abnormalities in eye contact. Look at this term. Oh. Abnormalities. Body language and deficits in understanding and use of gestures to a total lack of facial expression and nonverbal communication. So I will tell you my experience and you can say, yes, I've had this experience. No, I haven't. So sometimes in those really awkward conversations, I'm doing this, yeah. And then I'm thinking, gosh, if I was autistic, my face wouldn't be lying to this other person right now. I'm so concerned with that person's feelings about how I'm interacting with them that I have this social filter that I'm putting all of my facial expressions through, all my nonverbal communication through. How incredible and what a unique gift it is to not have to do that. Think about that. In our culture, what do we see that as? Rude, right? If we don't give some kind of facial expression affirmation, if we don't use gestures to communicate how interested we are or how bored we are, that's how usually we are able to interpret how to interact. Right? We interact with nonverbal and verbal communication. But for someone who doesn't do this, those nonverbal cues are meaningless. And so how can we, again, empathize with that experience and say, wow, I'm doing all my communication with my nonverbal language. How can I be clear? How can I use very clear verbal language to get my point across? to say what I'm saying with my body and my face. Yeah. All right.
That if they're done, I can't, I just want to stop. If they're done, say it. I have to know.
Yep.
The only way I can do it.
Clear, concise. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends. So looking around, and I see most of your phones out, right? When someone texts you, how fast do you text back? I know you'll say it depends who it is, right? But how fast do you usually text back? Pretty quick, right? Do you feel pressure to text back pretty quickly? Think about that person who is already saying, this is challenging for me. So I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to text you back right away. I'm going to see you tomorrow. I'll just respond to you in person tomorrow. So for someone who expects that immediate text response, what does that feel like? Rude, yeah, rejection. And so it's possible that that relationship isn't maintained. One of my favorite pieces of research actually shows that people with autism have zero problems making and maintaining friendships with other people with autism. Why? Same expectations or lack of expectations. Like, oh, you don't text me? My feelings aren't hurt. See you when I see you. I'm not feeling any sort of way because you didn't text me back.
I've noticed that people with autism seem to subconsciously automatically feel comfortable around somebody with autism, even if they're not told they have it.
It's this release of pressure. The pressure is gone. There's a lot of pressure in interactions, like, oh my gosh, I have to make a good impression. I have to adjust how I interact with you. Like when I'm interacting with my coworkers who know me very, very well, it's like, oh, I can breathe and be my goofy self. Let's be real, I'm pretty much my goofy self with everyone. I see some of my students I'm pretty goofy with too, but it is a lot of pressure to have to mask some of those characteristics of my goofiness or feeling like someone else's reaction to my true self is going to be bad. So people think that autistic people don't want to build relationships. It's not a lack of desire to build relationships. We all want human connection. It's the pressure that's felt with having to maintain a relationship through expectations that aren't shared. Okay. So how, again, how many of you have heard this term, autistic? Autistic people without autism. So how do we adjust our expectations as autistic people and saying, okay, I recognize that you probably won't text me back. It doesn't mean you don't want to be my friend. It just means your expectations are different. So again, how do we adjust? Motor movements, stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, simple motor stereotypes, lining up toys, flipping objects, echolalia. There's a couple things I think of here. How many of you have just like randomly, maybe when you're feeling overwhelmed or nervous, like there's a song that you sing or like a word that you say to calm yourself down, or there's something, you see something and it reminds you of something. Yeah. I'm gonna just call my daughter out who's watching online. So if you're watching like TikTok and stuff, and then all of a sudden you see something that reminds you of that TikTok, and all of a sudden you're quoting the TikTok, right? So at every time you see that thing, you're quoting the TikTok. That might be seen as stereotype or repetitive movements or speech. But we all have these things that we do. Maybe we don't do them as frequently or as obviously, but we do them. The best way to connect is when we acknowledge a shared experience. So if we say, oh, hey, I do that sometimes too, it's an easier opportunity for us to say, there's connection there. We might just have to work a little bit harder to make that connection.
I want to comment though, with pedicare, that could also be low TV.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily autism.
Mm-hmm. Mm. There's actually a lot of coexisting diagnoses like OCD and autism or ADHD and autism. And I want to hear your question so much, Victoria. Yes, dyslexia and autism. There's so many coexisting diagnoses. Yes. Yep.
And the voice one, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm just looking. Is that clock right too? Where's Georgia? Yeah, okay. Victoria, you know it's all love. Routine and consistency. So insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. Extreme distress at small changes, difficulties with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, need to take the same route or eat the same food every day. So this might say ritualistic. In neurodiversity, we might say it as, oh, people who really thrive on routine. So you see how it changes the connotation? So insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to someone who thrives on routine. Do you get a different feeling with each of those? Do you think you'd respond differently to each of those? Words matter. They have so much power. And so with this neurodiversity movement, how can we also adjust our interactions? Okay, so let's talk about some common experiences here. How many of you have how many of you go get coffee every morning or at least a few times a week? What would happen? Do you usually get the same drink, those of you who go? What would happen? What would be your response if you went to go get your drink and they said, oh, I'm sorry, we're all out? Immediately hear no. Strong reactions, anyone? Frustration? Do some of you leave without even ordering a different one? She's like, nope, I get some kind of caffeine. But the point here is we also have some insistence on sameness. I get the same drink everywhere. This one, my bestie over here, she makes fun of me because when we go to restaurants, if I find something I like, I order every single time because I don't want to have food envy. I don't want to get something new and say, oh, mine's horrible and you got something really good. I know that this is good and I'm going to insist on having the same thing. All right, interest and attachment. So highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. A strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or preservative interested. So, as autistic people, it's common to have empathy towards other people, even empathy towards animals. Somebody gets hurt, somebody's having a bad day, you see an animal on the side of the road, like there's something that rises in you that says, oh, I feel bad, I want to help, like I can feel what you're feeling. For people with autism, it's a common myth that autistic people don't have empathy. They can't have empathy because they're unable to connect with other people. That is false. In fact, that connection is sometimes so deep, that empathy is so strong that showing it requires too much energy. And so the only solution is to retreat. Like, this is taking too much out of me, and I can't even show the amount of empathy I'm feeling towards you right now. There's also something that autistic people experience where there's an empathy towards inanimate objects. So I have a niece, and she has autism, and she's now 18 years old. But when she was little, if she bumped into like a table, she'd go, "Oh, sorry," because she felt bad for the table. Like, how, I mean, if that doesn't make your heart burst, like, how can we be mad at that? Or if she tripped over a crack in the sidewalk, it was like, oh, I hope the sidewalk's okay. Like, that's a high level of empathy. That's some social intelligence I couldn't even dream of. So how do we shift our perspective? All right. Oh, this is my favorite one to talk about, especially because I just put this down. So sensory needs, hyper. So that's somebody who is seeking sensory input, and hypo, hypo, somebody who's seeking sensory input, hyper, someone who gets too much input and feels overwhelmed. So this is a common character trait for people with autism. But let's see. Let's see if anyone's doing it now. How many of you click your pens during meetings? Click your pens. Click your pens. Yeah. How many of you do finger taps, or this is my new favorite thing ever since I got convinced to get fake nails, the sound that it makes. Anybody else do that? How many of you shake your leg or tap your foot? Who rocks or sways? Guess what you're doing? Yes, you're stimming. You are finding a way to regulate yourself because of the sensory input you are experiencing from your surrounding environment. We all do it. I carry one of these with me everywhere. I also love when a conference has Play-Doh because I can play with Play-Doh the entire time, and it helps me focus. But do you write it down? Write it down.
I know I will.
Write it down. I promise I'll come back to you. Only because I do lose my train of thought. Yes, so being able to work out your sensory needs. So I need to focus. The only way I can focus is by doing something to regulate myself. For people who are autistic, we have learned, well, oh,
I got it.
oh, do I need to restart? I could do it. I know. Let's snooze it. Thank you. So for autistic people, we have learned it is not socially appropriate to throw ourselves on the floor when we're feeling overwhelmed. That's why those of you who are in here are clicking your pens or rocking or tapping your foot, because you know if you fall on the floor and throw a tantrum, everyone's going to look at you. You've been socialized in that way. For somebody with autism who maybe hasn't picked up on those social cues, you might see those regulatory strategies a lot more clearly, because the environment is so overwhelming. The only way that they could focus is to engage in those really big sensory stimming activities. So how do we, how are you all feeling about these lights in here? They're bright. Anyone else notice how bright they are? As soon as I came in, I was like, oh, these lights, and they have a cover. I actually don't turn the lights on in my office because the lighting hurts my eyes that much, and I can't focus on what I'm doing or grading or anything because the lights are so bright. In fact, our admin in child development often comes through and turns my light on. I'm like, oh no, I want it off. Thank you. I work in the dark. Save it, save it, save it. Yes, that is true. Okay, so let's look at cultural perspectives. So autism doesn't look the same everywhere. And we've talked about how do we approach these common characteristics that are outlined in the DSM, but are they the same across the world? The answer is no. If we look at, let's go to Senegal first. If we look at Senegal, children with autism actually are seen as divine beings. They're seen as children who should be worshipped because they have been embodied a spirit that allows them to talk to their deceased ancestors. So they're actually celebrated in Senegal. So do you think there's early intervention that's trying to fix children with autism in Senegal? Nope. Why? Because the perception is positive. Now, Laos is different. Laos has more of a negative connotation, as does sub-Saharan Africa, where children in Laos are actually seen as also having an evil spirit. But what's happening in Laos is they are providing early intervention services, but a lot of times these children get institutionalized. So they're not allowed to live with their family because their needs are so severe. They'll never really be able to communicate what they deem as appropriately or typically. And what's interesting is what would happen if our culture and the culture in Laos merged. What would happen?
I heard somebody was going here just for that reason.
I'm always interested. And do we impose our cultural perspective? Do we share knowledge? Do we negotiate understanding? So in sub-Saharan Africa, the evil spirit here is actually it's an evil spirit, not just a spirit, it's evil. And so again, the goal here is to be fixed. What's really interesting about sub-Saharan Africa is there's influence of the UK there. And there's some areas in the UK who also believe the same thing, that these children embody these evil spirits and they really shouldn't exist. All right, now let's look at cultural differences in traits. What did you see when we talked about nonverbal communication? What was an expectation in Western society? Eye contact. Is that the same everywhere? No. So in a lot of Eastern communities, avoiding eye contact is seen as respectful. And so their diagnostic criteria for autism doesn't include absence of eye contact, or else everyone would have autism. But for us, if somebody doesn't give us eye contact in the United States, what does that mean? Disrespectful, rude, it's this expectation. So it's interesting. I was talking to another bestie of mine who I think is watching online as well, and she's Muslim. And she said she spent her whole childhood going to Arabic school and them teaching her to not ever give eye contact because that's disrespectful. And then she goes into a US school and they're like, look at me. Look at me. She's like, I don't know what to do. And so there's this conflict of expectation between cultures. Research has also found that the US has a higher incidence of parents who report problem behaviors in children with autism than Eastern cultures. We're too picky. Our expectations are different than those of parents in other cultures. So what we deem as inappropriate behavior or problematic behavior might really just be the child trying to get their needs met. And maybe they can't communicate, I'm so tired, or the lights are so bright. So what am I going to do? Throw myself on the floor. What am I going to do? Bite you. Because I can't tell you I'm overwhelmed. So in other cultures, that might not be seen as something to fix, but instead something to support. And so parents don't report that as problematic. Okay, let's talk about environments. Somebody throw out an environment and let's break it apart. Oh gosh, the DMV. You can be autistic, neurodivergent, and I don't think anyone has a positive experience at the DMV. But let's break it apart. So the DMV, what are some sensory experiences you have at the DMV? What was that? Claustrophobic because people are too close together. What else do you experience there?
It's a rigid but well organized. You don't know the system. It's very frustrating.
Interesting. So yeah, she doesn't work there, but you value that routine and that rigidity, right? Of this is how it goes. It's my way or the highway. But for someone who's like, I need to go and my number's D6 and you just called Z11 and G14 is next. I don't know when my turn is and I really need to know. And so that is a really overstimulating and problematic environment. The being so close to people, you can feel them breathing on you, can be a problematic environment to even people who don't have autism, to autistic people. So think about that when you are observing environments you're in. Think about those experiences because they're going to support you in having that empathy for people who have autism. Throw out another environment. The airport, yeah, but I'm gonna go classroom only because we're in the classroom. Let's look at this one. How's the seating set up? Rows, yes. How many of you in the middle would not get up even if you were about to pee in your pants because you were going to have to stand up, get the attention, and walk past people? Oh my gosh, contact with other people. I'm gonna ask you to push your chair in. Oh my gosh, nope. I'd rather have an accident. Thank you very much. And so think about how that feels. And you don't have to have autism to appreciate that experience.
I take care of myself.
Take care of your needs. Yes, as we all should, but because when you're autistic, you have those, that keen awareness of other people's perceptions. And so you don't want to be perceived in a certain way. So you're just gonna sit there and suffer. Well, someone with autism might say, gotta go, and then just walk right past you. If we see that as a valuable skill, like, wow, I wish I had that. I really wish I could do that instead of sitting there and being miserable. All right, so how do we move towards acceptance and inclusion? This is geared towards the classroom, but we can really apply it anywhere. So normalize regulation strategies for the class. As a teacher, if I see students needing to get up, to get out of the classroom, to walk around, who doodle, I know they're still paying attention. That's what they're needing in order to focus. Drawing actually improves focus for a lot of people. And so how do we adjust ourselves as educators, for the educators in the room, to make sure that we're allowing for and normalizing self-stimulatory behavior and regulation? I'm like, I do it. I tap my nails when you can tell a student or tell each other like, oh yeah, just do it, you'll be fine. No one cares. Like that validation is really important for someone with autism. Contextualize learning to students' interests. So instead of seeing characteristics as rigidity and a hyper-focus interest on something, how can we turn that interest into an assignment? How can we support autistic people in advocating and saying, you know, I know your assignment is write an essay, a persuasive essay on, I don't know, cows, but you really like, that's the first thing that came to my head because we're on West Campus, but you as an autistic person really like horses. How can you say, I know that that's the assignment, but is it possible for me to write about horses using those same guidelines? Am I still meeting the criteria that you've laid out for me? Am I still practicing my writing? Yes. Do I get to use that interest in a way that aids my learning? Yes, everybody wins. Provide transition keys for writing and speaking. So one of my favorite examples is when class is over, a lot of times I'll forget to say, you can go. And so I'll have students that are like hanging out, just like waiting, and I'm looking at them kind of getting anxious, and I recognize, oh, you could go. You're ready to leave, you're waiting for me to tell you because you've been socialized. Oh, let me just commend you for your bravery, getting up and walking out to the side. I'm just kidding.
When's the next time? What's my expectation? Then I'm willing to leave.
Yeah.
And if the teacher puts on the bottom of the board quizzes next time, and what the chapter is, I don't have a whole lot of questions then.
So be clear, be concise. It's also good when you're having the interactions with people who have autism that you're clear in your communication too. If I look at you and say, hey, like what's going on? You might know that I'm talking to you because I'm looking at you, but someone with autism might not know that I'm talking with them. And in that case, I'll say, Jessica, because then I get her attention. So if you're talking to somebody with autism, use their name because then there's no guessing. There's no guesswork in it. They know exactly what you're doing. You're talking to them and it'll all be okay. Contracts. So Victoria, you shared that it's really helpful to know what's expected. That anxiety that comes with group work. As autistic students, I know my students despise group work with a passion. And it's because there's a negotiation of understanding, a negotiation of who's going to do what, a negotiation of responsibility. And so there's a lot of anxiety that goes with that. And so instead of having all this guessing going on, let's take the guesswork out of it. I talked about using direct and concise communication, describe and explain communication breakdowns. If you're noticing that the understanding isn't the same for everyone, talk about it. Bring it to the forefront of the conversation so that there's no guessing involved. Transition reminders. In about 5 minutes, this talk is going to be over. That's a transition reminder. And it's helpful because if you get anxious because you're not sure when I'm going to stop talking, now you know, and you can say, okay, my body knows what 5 minutes feels like. I can hang out for 5 minutes and be okay. Practice perspective taking. We practiced that this entire talk. What does that feel like? Have I experienced something similar? Can I empathize with that? You've all practiced that today. So I expect you all to be able to do it. Assist in how to prioritize assignments. For students with autism or just people with autism, it's often difficult when not given direct instruction to say, I need to do this assignment first, and then this assignment, and then this assignment, and then this assignment. It's, I don't know what to do. I'm just gonna pick this one because it's interesting. And then the one that's due tomorrow, I'm gonna ignore. So how do we support that as educators? Ask people what works best for them. Do you want to know how to support? Ask, how can I support you? I see that you're standing outside of the classroom and the class has started. How can I support you in walking in? And that could be for you with your classmates. Oh, wait. Hold on, sorry, one more. Don't take things personally. Be humble. I think a lot of times we get our feelings hurt when someone is really just trying to communicate. And so be really humble and give people the benefit of the doubt. Yes. So I'm going to leave you all with 2 quotes and then I'll take questions. So Temple Grandin, love her. I got a book signed by her and she was fantastic. She came to MJC and spoke. But she says, acceptance is the key to unlocking the potential of every person. We all have potential. As much as I'm not a fan of Hans Asperger, he also said, not a brain should be wasted, which I think is really valuable. And then the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network says autism acceptance means understanding and valuing the phenomenal diversity of human experience. And that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'll stay for questions.
Dr. Brandon, students, one sit right here.
That one. Like in a room full of people to feel like